Welcome to The Curious Case, where every story begins with a whisper and ends with a quiet truth. I'm your host, here to guide you through another evening of calm reflection and quiet mystery. Settle in, pour yourself a cup of tea, and let the sound of the sea carry you back to gentler times when observation was an art, and small details could change everything. Before we begin, tell me, from which corner of the world are you listening tonight? I read every single one, and every answer adds warmth to our little circle of curiosity. The carriage stopped before the Seaview Hotel just as the tide turned. Miss Marple stepped out, small suitcase in hand, her eyes noting the quiet order of the place. White balconies, polished brass, the faint scent of beeswax polish drifting from the open doors. Inside, the clock ticked with measured patience, the kind kept by people who value routine. The manager greeted her with courteous warmth. The maid curtsied, eyes alert yet modest. A vase of early roses stood on the counter, one petal beginning to curl. Miss Marple smiled gently. Order, she thought, never lasts without attention. And as the sea murmured beyond the terrace, she felt that something here had already slipped, quietly, out of place. Morning light spread softly across the breakfast room. The air held the mixed scent of coffee, toast, and sea salt drifting through the half-open windows. Silverware clicked in steady rhythm, a quiet orchestra of civility. Miss Marple took her usual place by the window, not for the view, but for the vantage. The Seaview Hotel ran like a clock. Mrs. Lacey, the housekeeper, passed from table to table with the calm authority of long habit. The young maid, Violet, refilled cups before they were empty. Even the manager's steps had their patterned 3 strides. Pause. Turn. It was, Miss Marple thought, a small world of routine, where every movement told a story of order maintained. She stirred her tea, eyes following the gentle pattern of morning life. Professor Greaves unfolded his newspaper with the same crisp motion each day. Lady Westbrook buttered her toast with slow precision, as though each stroke of the knife proved dignity. The newlyweds, the Langleys, sat opposite one another, smiling too often, laughing too quickly. There was warmth, but not ease. A soft clatter broke the rhythm. The young husband had dropped his teaspoon. He bent to retrieve it. His wife looked toward the window, not at the sea, but at another table. The gesture was brief, barely a glance. Yet something in it tightened the air for a moment, like a chord struck out of key. Miss Marple did not stare. She continued to sip her tea, as one who thinks of nothing in particular, but her mind recorded the small break in harmony. A glance avoided, a laugh delayed, a silence a second too long. These were her clues, more revealing than any confession. Violet passed again with the coffee pot. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured, though her smile never wavered. The manager noticed, frowned, then turned away. Routine restored itself, though its surface now showed the faintest ripple. Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly and placed it beside her plate. Peace, she reflected, was a fragile thing. It required not the absence of disturbance, but the steady presence of care. When people stopped attending to the small things, truth began to move quietly, invisibly beneath the pattern of daily life. Outside, the tide touched the sand and withdrew again, as if testing the strength of the shore. By mid-morning, the drawing-room had filled with polite conversation. The guests gathered as they always did after breakfast, drifting toward comfort chairs by the fire, newspapers, embroidery, a little talk to pass the time. The sea shone beyond the tall windows, steady and pale. Lady Westbrook sat near the mantel, every movement deliberate, the kind of woman who had long ago learned that silence often commands more attention than speech. She nodded kindly to Miss Marple. A fine morning, she said, her tone suggesting ownership of the weather itself. The Langleys entered next, the newlyweds from London. The young wife, Clara, wore a soft blue dress, slightly too elegant for the seaside. Her husband, Arthur, looked proud and restless, his hand never far from his pocket watch. They greeted the room with bright smiles, yet their eyes did not quite meet. Professor Greaves followed a tall, stooped man who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and salt air. He bowed to Lady Westbrook and claimed his usual chair by the window, unfolding his newspaper with a rustle that marked the beginning of his daily vigil. Miss Marple observed the small theatre of routine unfold. Words about weather, health, and tea. Smiles perfectly measured. No tension on the surface, yet she had long learned that what people mean is rarely what they say. Her attention shifted to the small table beside the settee. A single glove lay there, pale cream leather, finely stitched, not dropped carelessly, but placed as if remembered too late. Next to it lay a telegram slip, folded once, the paper faintly creased, as though handled often. Neither item seemed to belong to anyone present. Violet, entering to adjust the curtains, paused when she saw them. Her eyes flickered, quick and uncertain, before she smoothed her apron and continued her work. Miss Marple noticed the movement hesitation, not surprise. The conversation drifted toward trivialities, and the glove remained untouched. Only Miss Marple seemed to notice the way every guest's glance slid past it, polite and deliberate, as though an unspoken rule forbade inquiry. She took her knitting from her bag and began a new row, her mind quietly recording the order of things. People reveal themselves not in what they hide, but in how they pretend not to see. The clock ticked, steady and polite. Outside, the tide turned again, and the glove waited for someone to claim it. Evening settled over the Seaview Hotel with its usual precision. Lamps were lit at 7, curtains drawn at 7:15. The scent of polished wood and faint lavender filled the lounge. Guests gathered again, drawn to the quiet comfort of routine. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her knitting in her lap, the steady rhythm of the needles keeping time with the soft murmur of conversation. Lady Westbrook spoke of bridge. Professor Greaves mentioned the tides. Mr. Langley laughed a shade too loudly at something his wife had not said. The harmony was almost perfect, and that, Miss Marple thought, was the trouble. Too much agreement, too few natural pauses. Every smile arrived half a second late, every remark rehearsed. People wished to appear at ease, yet no one seemed truly comfortable. Even the fire crackled with exaggerated cheer. The manager entered with a tray of sherry glasses. His polished shoes made no sound on the carpet. The maid followed, careful to keep her eyes lowered. Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in the girl's hand as she placed a glass before Lady Westbrook. The liquid quivered, almost spilling, before she steadied it with a quiet breath. Conversation resumed, smooth and polished, like the brass fittings on the mantel. Professor Greaves recited a small anecdote from his days at Oxford. Laughter followed, measured, polite, entirely without joy. The newlyweds exchanged a glance so brief it could have been imagined, but Miss Marple did not imagine such things. She simply noticed them. Her gaze wandered to the piano at the far end of the room. No one had played it yet that season. Its lid stood open, reflecting the lamplight like still water. Dust gathered faintly along one corner, neglected amid the hotel's otherwise perfect order. Perfection invites neglect, she reflected. When everything appears untroubled, no one dares disturb it even to make it true. The clock chimed the half-hour. The sound lingered longer than it should have, soft but insistent. Miss Marple looked around the room, every face still smiling, every voice still composed. It was a lovely evening, calm and complete. Yet beneath the silver calm, something waited. Perfection, she knew, was rarely honest. The next morning began, as all mornings did at the Seaview Hotel, quietly, efficiently, with the scent of fresh bread and the soft hum of the sea. Sunlight reached across the breakfast room, glinting on silver pots and porcelain cups. Yet something in the air had shifted. Miss Marple noticed it first in the staff. The rhythm of service, usually smooth as clockwork, now faltered. Violet poured tea with unusual care, her eyes straying toward the staircase. The manager entered twice, each time glancing about as though expecting someone who had not yet arrived. Lady Westbrook sat upright behind her newspaper, her lips pressed tight. The professor stirred his porridge longer than necessary. Mr. Langley glanced at the doorway, then back at his untouched plate. Conversation, once full of gentle nothings, had thinned to polite fragments. Miss Marple folded her napkin and waited. When Violet passed near, she asked quietly, "A smaller crowd this morning?" The girl hesitated. "Mrs. Langley hasn't come down, ma'am. Mr. Langley says she wasn't feeling herself." Miss Marple nodded. "Ah, these coastal mornings can be rather heavy." Her tone was mild, but her eyes were thoughtful. She had seen many colds and headaches used to cover silence, but few that changed the air of a whole room. Mr. Langley arrived a few minutes later, slightly flushed, his hair untidy. He offered apologies that no one had asked for. "Clara's resting," he said quickly. "Just a touch of fatigue. She'll be right as rain by luncheon." His voice was calm, but his sleeve cuff was misbuttoned, and he buttered the wrong side of his toast. The professor murmured a sympathetic comment. Lady Westbrook gave a single nod, the kind meant to close the subject. Yet the room did not quite breathe again. The sound of the clock returned to prominence, louder than usual, marking each second with measured disapproval. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She had seen it many times before, the way order holds itself upright, even when something essential is missing. Politeness becomes the first form of defense. Outside, gulls circled above the water, their cries thin and distant. Inside, the guests finished breakfast without appetite, speaking softly of anything but the obvious. Order had not broken. It had simply begun to pretend. By mid-morning, the story of Mrs. Langley's absence had already changed shape twice. Miss Marple, seated in the lounge with her knitting, heard each version arrive like a tide, soft, regular, slightly different with every wave. Lady Westbrook was the first to speak of it. She confided in her careful whisper that the young bride had suffered a fainting spell. "The sea air," she said, "was often too bracing for city women." Miss Marple nodded politely. The explanation was neat, a little too neat. Later, Professor Greaves offered another account. According to him, Mr. Langley had mentioned a troublesome letter that had upset his wife. Nothing serious, merely a matter of family business. Miss Marple thanked him for the information and resumed her knitting. By 11, the chambermaid, always eager to talk when she thought no one was listening, told Violet that Mrs. Langley had gone walking early, before breakfast, and hadn't returned. Violet, catching Miss Marple's glance, quickly bent to rearrange the flowers. No one wished to say more. Miss Marple continued to observe, quiet and unhurried. Mr. Langley had appeared again, claiming to have sent for a doctor, though no one had seen one arrive. He stood too long at the reception desk, speaking in low tones with the manager, his back rigid, his gestures deliberate. Guests passed through the lobby with polite expressions, pretending nothing was amiss. Yet their eyes flicked toward the staircase as they moved, betraying curiosity they would not voice. The normal rhythm of the hotel persisted, but its beat had changed steady on the surface, uncertain underneath. At luncheon, Lady Westbrook repeated her earlier story, now adding that the young woman had quite recovered. Professor Greaves looked up from his soup, surprised. He had heard she was still confined to her room. The difference hung between them, small but distinct. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Stories, she thought, have their own manners. They change coats to suit their company. The manager entered with the air of a man preserving calm. He announced that all was well, and the guests relaxed outwardly. Yet conversation lagged, as if everyone sensed that words now carried weight. Miss Marple folded her napkin. Order held, but it trembled slightly like china set too near the edge of the table. Rain drifted in from the sea that afternoon, soft and steady, tapping against the window panes like quiet fingers. The guests lingered indoors, reading, knitting, pretending not to listen for footsteps that never came. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and beeswax polish, a scent that belonged to ordinary days but somehow felt different now. Miss Marple sat near the writing desk in the lounge, her needles still. She had noticed something odd that morning, a small change in the order of things. The glove that had lain on the side table 2 days earlier had vanished after breakfast. Now it was back again, resting neatly upon the same polished surface, though the table had been dusted just an hour before. It was not merely replaced, it had been handled. A faint smudge of salt marked the edge, and the leather looked slightly darker, as if brushed by damp air. She leaned forward, not touching, only observing. Beneath the glove lay a folded handkerchief, fine linen, embroidered with the initial C. It had not been there before. The maid Violet entered carrying a vase of new flowers. When her eyes fell on the table, her step faltered for the smallest moment. "Shall I move these things, ma'am?" she asked. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "No, my dear. Best to leave them where they are. They seem quite comfortable together." Violet smiled uncertainly and withdrew. The faint smell of salt water lingered in her wake. A few minutes later, Lady Westbrook approached, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She commented on the weather, the damp, and the unreliability of modern forecasts. Her gaze brushed the glove and handkerchief but did not linger. "Someone really ought to claim that," she murmured, then turned the subject to bridge. When she had gone, Professor Greaves came to fetch his newspaper. He stopped at the table, frowned, then shook his head. "Strange," he muttered. "I could have sworn that belonged to Mrs. Langley." His tone was mild, yet his eyes avoided Miss Marple's. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Rain streaked the glass in narrow threads. Outside, the sea had turned the color of pewter. She recalled the maid's trembling hand that morning, the husband's restless glance, the glove's faint scent of salt. The pattern was still incomplete, but she could already sense its shape. Objects, she reflected, rarely move of their own accord. People, however, move them for reasons they prefer not to explain. By evening, the glove and handkerchief were gone again. The table shone empty under the lamplight, as though it had never held anything at all. The manager walked by, pausing briefly, perhaps noticing the same absence, perhaps not. Miss Marple closed her knitting bag. The day had ended as quietly as it began, yet nothing about it was the same. In a place built on order, disorder often arrived, not with noise but with something slightly damp, slightly misplaced, and slightly too carefully returned. The corridors of the Seaview Hotel were never truly silent. Even in the stillness of afternoon, faint sounds moved through them, the soft roll of a trolley, the distant closing of a door, the hum of footsteps muffled by carpet. Miss Marple found comfort in these small signs of life. They meant the world was behaving as it should. Yet today, the pattern had changed. The footsteps paused too often. The tones were lower, the pauses longer. She noticed it as she walked toward the library after tea. The air smelled faintly of polish and rain-damp linen. Somewhere nearby, a whisper folded into another, then stopped altogether. She slowed her pace, pretending to examine a small framed photograph on the wall, a faded image of the hotel in its early years, when gentlemen still wore hats to breakfast. Behind her, two voices murmured in the service corridor. "It isn't safe to keep it there," one said. A woman's voice, careful and soft. "Violet's, perhaps." "It'll have to stay until he says different," came the reply. The man spoke quickly, the rhythm of someone rehearsing calm. "If they notice, it's not our fault." A short silence followed. Miss Marple caught the sound of a key turning, then the quiet thud of a door closing. She continued walking, her shoes barely brushing the carpet. The door at the end of the corridor opened suddenly, and Mrs. Lacey, the housekeeper, stepped out. Her face held its usual efficiency, though her voice carried an edge. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you. I hope the corridor isn't too draughty. The windows tend to rattle in this weather." "Not at all," said Miss Marple kindly. "I was admiring the photographs. Such a sense of history here." Mrs. Lacey smiled, but the smile came a second too late. "Indeed, the hotel keeps its memories." She moved on, the scent of lavender starch trailing faintly behind her. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, glancing toward the service door. It bore no sign, yet its brass handle gleamed brighter than the others recently touched, recently polished. A faint trace of sea salt marked the wood just beneath the knob. She noted it quietly and turned away. Back in the lounge, the guests spoke of harmless things, the weather, the price of butter, the coming spring fete. No one mentioned the missing glove, or the absent wife, or the tension that had crept into the staff's routine. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression mild. She thought of the whisper, the locked door, and the scent of salt that clung to it. In hotels, she reflected, words travelled like steam rising through cracks, fogging the truth, then vanishing altogether. But the air they left behind always told its own story. The tone was calm, the meaning anything but. The next dawn came shrouded in mist. The sea had lost its colour, and even the gulls sounded distant, their cries softened by fog. Inside the Seaview Hotel, the air was unusually still. Doors remained closed longer than usual. The normal hum of morning work began late, cautious, as if the house itself hesitated to wake. Miss Marple, a creature of habit, descended the staircase promptly at 8. The carpet muffled her steps. Somewhere below, a single door opened, then closed again. A hurried whisper followed the kind meant to sound calm, but wasn't. She reached the landing and paused. The scent of coffee should have met her by now. Instead, there was only the faint odor of damp air and metal polish. From the far corridor came the sound of running feet, quick, uncertain, then suddenly stopping. A bell rang once at the reception desk, not the cheerful ring of service, but a sharper note. She turned the corner and saw Violet standing near the doorway, her hands clasped tight, her eyes wide. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began, then stopped herself, glancing toward the manager who had just appeared from the office. His face was pale, his tone controlled. "It's nothing, Violet. Just a small disturbance by the lower path. Please return to your duties." The girl nodded but did not move. Other guests began to drift from the dining room, their curiosity wrapped in politeness. Lady Westbrook appeared in her dressing gown, one hand gripping the banister. "What sort of disturbance?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. The manager's answer was soft. "An accident, Lady Westbrook. The constable has been called." A hush followed. The professor removed his spectacles, as though the world might look different without them. Mr. Langley appeared last, slower than the rest. His collar was crooked, his face drawn. He avoided every gaze. Miss Marple said nothing. She stepped to the window. The mist outside pressed close against the glass, veiling the garden and the cliff beyond. Yet she could just make out 2 figures moving along the path, the constable and a porter, bent over something near the rocks. She turned back, her expression calm. Panic was useless. Facts were patient. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we should allow them room to work." The others obeyed her tone more than her words. One by one they withdrew, returning to chairs and teacups and folded hands. The murmurs faded, replaced by the rhythmic tick of the lobby clock. The manager crossed to the reception desk and quietly shut the ledger. His hands trembled once before he steadied them. Miss Marple watched the mist curl along the window frame. Nature, she reflected, often hides its harshest truths behind softness. The fog covers, but it also reveals once you know where to look. By mid-morning, the fog had begun to lift, leaving the lawns damp and pale. The front steps of the Seaview Hotel glistened faintly, as though the mist had taken something with it and left silence in its place. That was when Inspector Collins arrived. He entered with the measured authority of a man used to discomforting people politely. His coat was dark, his manner plain. He spoke, little as he gave his hat and gloves to the porter, yet the small details of his movements precise, efficient, made even the grand foyer seem suddenly smaller. Miss Marple observed him from her seat near the writing desk, her knitting laid aside. She could always tell, within seconds, whether a man preferred truth or convenience. This one, she decided, preferred truth, but truth, like tea, required proper steeping. "Inspector Collins, sir," announced the manager, standing a little too straight. "We are most distressed by the morning's event." "Quite so," the inspector replied. His voice was steady, stripped of sympathy, but not unkind. "We'll have clarity soon enough." He opened his small leather notebook. The paper crackled faintly as he turned to a fresh page. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, noted the time written at the top 10:17 a.m. She had been watching the lobby clock. It showed 10:24, a 7-minute difference. Small but worth remembering. The inspector questioned the manager first. His tone was firm, professional, never raised. Every question built upon the last, each answer neatly pinned to the page. Miss Marple admired the structure. It reminded her of crochet work done in tight patterns. Then he turned to the maid, Violet, who trembled despite his calmness. "You found it first?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she whispered, "near the path to the beach." He nodded. "And you touched nothing?" "No, sir." Miss Marple noticed her hands twisting the edge of her apron. The inspector noticed too, but said nothing. He only wrote something in his book, 3 words. Small, deliberate. Mr. Langley appeared next, his expression composed but his posture uncertain. He gave the same account twice, though the order of his sentences shifted slightly each time. The inspector's brow moved almost imperceptibly, but Miss Marple caught it. She understood that gesture well. It meant he had found the thread he would later pull. When the questioning paused, Miss Marple approached quietly. "You keep excellent time, Inspector," she said mildly. He glanced at her, curious. "Habit, ma'am." "Yes," she murmured. "It always begins with habit." Their eyes met briefly, professional courtesy between 2 people who observed more than they spoke. When he left to continue his work, Miss Marple returned to her chair. The clock resumed its steady ticking. She thought of the notebook, the 7-minute gap, the faint tremor in Violet's voice. Order was being reassembled, but it would not yet hold. Truth, she reflected, is like tidewater. It withdraws before it returns, and it always leaves its mark upon the sand. The morning passed in small, deliberate movements. Cups lifted, papers folded, footsteps hushed. The Seaview Hotel clung to its manners like a ship clings to anchor rope in fog. Yet beneath the calm, something had begun to shift. Miss Marple felt it in the air, the fragile unease that follows a lie told too neatly. Inspector Collins moved with quiet purpose from guest to guest, noting times, gestures, and repetitions. He had that rare patience of men who know that truth seldom shouts. It whispers, often out of sequence. Miss Marple watched, her hands idle in her lap, her mind far from still. It was the maid Violet who spoke first. She told the inspector she had seen Mr. Langley come down the main staircase at 7:30, or just after. She remembered because she had been placing flowers in the lounge, and the lobby clock had chimed the half-hour. He had wished her good morning, asked for the newspaper, and gone toward the dining room. A simple statement, offered earnestly. 10 minutes later, the inspector asked the manager for his recollection. Mr. Peterson, dignified as always, replied that Mr. Langley had come to the reception desk a few minutes before 7, asking whether any telegrams had arrived. He had then gone out for a walk, returning just after 8. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. The difference was small, a mere half-hour, but small differences are where truth hides most comfortably. She looked toward the clock above the fireplace. It still ran 7 minutes fast, as she had quietly confirmed that morning. The inspector had not yet noticed. Time, she thought, was like character. Everyone adjusted it to appear a little better than it was. By luncheon, the contradiction had not been resolved. Mr. Langley continued to insist he had breakfasted alone at 7, while Violet, honest and frightened, swore she had seen him later. The manager grew pale under the inspector's steady gaze. Miss Marple said nothing. She only asked for another cup of tea, stirring it absently. Her mind was already working, arranging clocks, footsteps, distances, and glances into quiet sequence. There were patterns in human behavior just as in knitting. A wrong stitch early on would always reveal itself by the final row. Outside, the mist thinned to a pale shimmer, leaving the cliff path clear. The sea below was calm. Too calm. The inspector closed his notebook. "We'll sort the times presently," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. 7 minutes, perhaps, she murmured, her voice so soft he barely heard her. But 7 minutes can hide a lifetime. He glanced toward her, uncertain whether she meant the remark as comfort or warning. She did not clarify. Truth, she reflected, rarely arrived on schedule. It simply waited patient, exact, and impossible to hurry. The afternoon light fell gently through the tall windows, laying soft rectangles across the carpet. The Seaview Hotel had regained its poise, or seemed to have. Guests spoke again in low, careful tones. The teacups rattled a little less. but Miss Marple knew when calmness was only a performance. She found Violet in the small linen room near the service corridor, folding towels with more precision than necessary. The faint scent of starch hung in to the air. Outside, a gull cried once and was gone. "My dear," said Miss Marple in her mildest voice, "you look busy." Violet smiled quickly. "Always something to do, ma'am." "Of course," Miss Marple said, watching her hands. "A hotel runs on small habits. I've always admired that." She waited, letting silence open space between them. "I hear the inspector has been asking about the breakfast trays." Violet's folding slowed. "Yes, ma'am. Just routine questions." "I'm sure," Miss Marple replied gently. "Routine can be very revealing." Violet hesitated, then placed the towel on the pile and straightened the edge with care. "It's only that things weren't quite as usual yesterday morning." "In what way?" "The breakfast trays," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Normally I take them to the rooms on the first floor at 9 sharp. But Mrs. Lacey switched the order, asked me to do the second floor first instead. Said the guests upstairs were early risers." Miss Marple nodded, eyes steady. "And the Langley's room?" Violet's fingers twisted a corner of cloth. "By the time I got there, it had already been done. The bed made, towels changed, tray gone. But not by me, ma'am. And Mrs. Lacey swore she hadn't sent anyone else." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "And yet everything appeared in order?" "Yes, ma'am," Violet said. "Too perfect, if that makes sense. The towels were folded the wrong way, neat but not in the hotel style, and the tray had crumbs on the wrong side of the plate." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Sometimes imitation speaks louder than truth." The maid looked up, eyes uncertain. "You don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "that you notice things others overlook. That's a virtue, though not always a comfortable one." Violet exhaled slowly, some of her fear releasing with it. "I didn't want to say anything wrong, ma'am. People talk." "People always talk," said Miss Marple, "but only a few observe." They stood a moment longer, the steady hum of the corridor filling the space between them. When Miss Marple returned to the lounge, the fog had begun to creep in again from the sea. She paused at the window, reflecting. Order that is too perfect rarely belongs to honesty. It belongs to those who wish to appear blameless, and seldom are. The next morning brought pale sunlight, the kind that seems to hide more than it reveals. Breakfast was served quietly, each guest careful not to mention the inspector's inquiries. The air in the Seaview Hotel felt thinner, as though even the walls were listening. Miss Marple sat near the lobby, her knitting on her lap, when James, the young bellhop, passed by pushing a trolley stacked with fresh linens. The faint rattle of its wheels echoed along the tiled floor. She watched him a moment, then spoke softly. "You keep a steady hand, James. That trolley sounds almost musical." He smiled, startled by her friendliness. "Thank you, ma'am. It's the floor that sings, not me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Then perhaps you've heard many verses in these halls." He hesitated, then stopped the trolley. "It's strange you say that, ma'am. I've been trying to remember something from the morning before the accident." She nodded slightly. "Memory improves when it's given company. Sit a moment if you wish." He perched awkwardly on the edge of a chair, cap in his hands. "It was early, before 7. I was bringing hot water to the upper rooms. I heard a door close quick and quiet, and then the sound of someone hurrying down the back stairs. Not the main ones. The service stairs by the west wing." Miss Marple listened without interruption. "At first, I thought it was Mrs. Lacey," he continued, "but then I caught a trace of perfume. Not hers. Something lighter, like lilies or jasmine. And whoever it was moved fast. I saw just a shadow on the landing, and then the outer door opened. When I went by a few minutes later, it was still swinging." "Which door exactly?" "The one leading toward the path by the cliff, ma'am." Miss Marple looked down at her folded hands. "And you're certain of the time?" James nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I remember because the trolley wheel squeaked just then. and I said to myself I'd oil it after breakfast. Did you? I did, ma'am. He gave a small, proud smile. Miss Marple thanked him and sent him back to his duties. The trolley wheels resumed their low murmur, a small song of routine returning. She remained seated, her gaze resting on the polished floor where the tracks of the trolley had faintly marked the dust. A woman's shadow, a door swinging open, the scent of lilies. These were not facts to the careless eye, but to her they were lines in a pattern forming quietly beneath the surface. People, she reflected, rarely remember time as it was. They remember it as it felt hurried, nervous, or kind. And sometimes that difference can tell more than truth itself. That afternoon, a mild drizzle returned. It tapped gently against the tall windows of the Seaview Hotel, soft enough not to disturb conversation, yet steady enough to remind one of time passing. Miss Marple, however, had no interest in the weather. Her attention was drawn instead to the small, leather-bound ledger resting upon the reception desk. Mr. Blind. Peterson, the manager, guarded it with habitual care. A man's pride often lies in the order of his records. Yet pride can sometimes hide what it most fears to show. When Miss Marple approached the desk, he straightened, polite but wary. "Can I assist you, Miss Marple? Perhaps you'd like the newspaper?" "Later, perhaps," she replied gently. "I was admiring your handwriting. So exact. A rare virtue these days." He softened a little. "I find precision keeps misunderstandings away." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Though I've noticed misunderstandings have a habit of slipping in between lines, not within them." He smiled thinly, uncertain whether it was praise or warning. The ledger lay open to the previous week's entries, a list of arrivals and departures written in dark ink, each date aligned perfectly in neat columns. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, her eyes taking in the rhythm of the script. Names, initials, room numbers, all orderly, all consistent, all except one. The Langley entry. The handwriting there was not the same. The shape of the L lacked the small upward flick Mr. Peterson used everywhere else. The ink was slightly lighter, as if the pen had been changed. It was dated 2 days later than she remembered hearing of their arrival. She said nothing. Instead, she asked pleasantly, "Do you keep a separate list for telegrams?" "Why, yes," he said, turning another page. "We record their receipt and delivery times for accounting." Her gaze followed his finger. Again, she noted a small irregularity, a telegram marked, "Received 7:30 a.m." Yet the ink and alignment matched an entry written much later. The time, she realized, was exactly 7 minutes off from the hotel clock, the same difference she had marked in Inspector Collins's notebook. She thanked him with her usual courtesy and withdrew to the lounge. The drizzle had grown heavier, blurring the view of the sea. She settled near the fire, knitting untouched beside her. The pattern was beginning to take shape. A changed entry. A shifted time. A telegram moved in the ledger as one might move a pawn on a chessboard, quietly, confidently, and with intent. Order, she reflected, can be the neatest disguise of all. When men fear discovery, they polish their work twice. But handwriting tells truth even when words do not. She looked again toward the desk, where Mr. Peterson stood smoothing the page, edges, restoring their perfect line. It was a careful gesture, too careful. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People, she thought, reveal themselves most clearly when tidying up their lies. The storm passed in the night. By morning, the world had that washed, uncertain brightness that follows heavy rain. Miss Marple descended early, finding the lounge almost empty. Only the soft smell of damp carpets and cooling embers lingered. The hotel was quiet again, but not restful. Quiet, she knew, was what people created when there was too much they preferred not to say. She walked toward the sideboard, where a few framed photographs stood beside a vase of wilted roses. Most showed cheerful hotel events, summer dances, picnics, small gatherings of smiling guests. The kind of images that insist upon happiness. One, however, caught her attention. It showed a garden fete, perhaps a year old. The ink on the inscription had begun to fade. Seaview Hotel, annual summer gala. The group stood arranged by rank and habit, the manager in the center, the housekeeper beside him, a row of guests smiling dutifully for the camera. Yet in the far corner, half turned toward the light, was a young woman whose face Miss Marple recognized at once. Mrs. Langley, or rather, the woman everyone called Mrs. Langley. Her hair was darker then, her posture easier, unguarded. Standing next to her was a man who looked familiar too, not Mr. Langley, but another guest from the same week. A banker, if memory served. The connection was faint yet certain. Miss Marple studied the photograph more closely. Someone had tried to erase a name from the edge of the mount, a smear of ink, a faint tear where a label had been removed. The surface bore a single fingerprint mark, glossy where it caught the light. Not old, recently touched. She looked around. No one else was in the room. Beside the photograph lay a folded envelope, left as though by mistake. The paper was thick, cream-colored, faintly, scented with lilies. Her fingers hovered above it, not touching, only reading the small inscription, Mrs. Clara Langley. The handwriting was not her husband's. She read only the first line inside, enough to see the tone of familiarity, the hint of secrecy. That was all she needed. The words themselves were unimportant. What mattered was their presence and their timing. She replaced the letter exactly as she found it and adjusted the frame by half an inch. Then she sat in her chair and folded her hands. The pattern was complete now. The changed ledger, the 7-minute difference, the false arrivals, the misplaced glove. It all fit too neatly to be coincidence. The sea outside, grey and calm, seemed to hold its breath with her. She would say nothing yet. Truth, like a letter, required the right recipient. Her gaze returned to the photograph. Paper, she thought, remembered what people tried to forget. It did not forgive, and it never lied. The following afternoon, Inspector Collins gathered everyone in the drawing room. The curtains were partly drawn against the grey light, and the fire burned low. The sea beyond the windows looked still, like glass. A hush settled, the kind that precedes either confession or relief. Miss Marple sat quietly in the armchair nearest the hearth, her small figure calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The inspector stood beside her, notebook closed. He had asked her to speak. "Perhaps," she began softly, "it would help to consider time not hours and minutes, but habits. People, after all, move according to what comforts them, and comfort, when disturbed, leaves traces." Her tone was gentle, almost conversational. Yet every sentence found its mark. "The Langleys arrived, according to the ledger, on a Tuesday," she continued. "But the entry was not written until Thursday. By then, another couple had already left under different names, but with the same handwriting on their bill. That small change told me someone had rewritten time." The inspector nodded slightly. She went on. "The maid noticed the towels folded differently. A second person had entered the room. The tray was returned by the wrong route, through the service stairs. That means Mrs. Langley was not resting, as claimed she had already left the room. And someone else had reason to make it appear she had not." Mr. Langley shifted in his seat. His hand tightened around the armrest. "Surely you're not suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing, sir," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I am observing that at 7:30 the hotel clock chimed, but the inspector's notebook shows 10 minutes difference. In those 10 minutes, a telegram was sent, one that never reached its supposed recipient." The inspector unfolded a small slip of paper. "It was sent to a London address under another name," he confirmed quietly. Miss Marple's gaze rested on Mr. Langley. "Your wife discovered that the name you used before your marriage was still active. She confronted you, I think, and left the hotel to post something of her own. But she never reached the post office. Someone followed her along the cliff path, perhaps to reason with her, perhaps only to delay her." Langley's composure cracked like thin glass. "You can't prove." "No," said Miss Marple, her tone still mild. "But you already have. Your handwriting gave you away, not your words, but your pen. You copied the ledger entry to make the days align, and in doing so, forgot your own flourish on the L. Small things reveal the largest truths." Silence filled the room. The inspector closed his notebook and gave a single nod. Outside, The wind stirred the sea into motion once more. Miss Marple looked into the fire. "We all rewrite time when we wish to forget," she said softly. "But time, like truth, has its own memory, and it keeps better books than we do. When the truth had been spoken, it did not echo. It simply settled quiet, certain, irreversible. The drawing-room remained still for several long seconds. The only sound was the clock, ticking as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Inspector Collins stood with measured calm. "Mr. Langley," he said quietly, "you'll come with us, please." There was no protest. Langley rose, pale but composed, and adjusted his cuff with a motion almost habitual. It was the gesture of a man still clinging to manners when all else had gone. His gaze moved briefly toward the window, where the sea stretched grey and endless, then to Miss Marple. "You saw it all along," he said. She shook her head gently. "Not all, only what you could not help showing." He gave a short, weary nod and followed the inspector from the room. The door closed softly behind them. For a moment, no one spoke. The guests, who had gathered in quiet clusters, remained where they were neither curious nor shocked, only subdued. Lady Westbrook's hands rested motionless on her lap. Professor Greaves removed his spectacles and cleaned them with slow care, as though vision itself required order to return. The manager, Mr. Peterson, crossed to the sideboard and straightened a vase that did not need straightening. "Terrible business," he murmured, his tone respectful, his posture exact. "Yet, one must keep the place running." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Order helps the heart to understand what the mind cannot." Violet appeared at the doorway, hesitant. "Shall I bring tea, ma'am?" "Tea," Miss Marple agreed. "Always helps." As the girl left, the sound of the sea rose faintly through the open window, the steady hush of water against stone, returning, reclaiming its rhythm. It was as though the world, having held its breath through deceit, now exhaled. Inspector Collins re-entered alone. "He's confessed enough for the record," he said. "We'll manage the rest quietly." Miss Marple nodded. "Quietly is best. Some truths need no audience." He gave her a small, respectful bow. "You have a talent for finding what hides in plain sight, ma'am." She smiled, almost wistfully. "It's habit, Inspector. When you've spent a lifetime mending small tears, you learn where fabric gives way." When he left, the room grew peaceful again. The fire burned evenly. The faint clatter of cups came from the hall. Miss Marple looked toward the empty chair Langley had occupied. There was no triumph in her expression, only a kind of sympathy, the quiet sorrow reserved for those who ruin themselves tidily. The sea continued its whisper, the same sound as before, though everything within the hotel had changed. Truth, once spoken softly, fills every corner. It does not shout. It simply remains like the tide, steady, patient, and impossible to turn back. The evening settled gently over the Seaview Hotel. A pale sky, faintly streaked with rose, faded into grey. Inside, lamps glowed low, and the smell of polished brass and wood smoke filled the air. Order, after all, has a way of returning quietly, like an old servant slipping back into place. Miss Marple sat by the fire, a shawl around her shoulders, her teacup resting on the small table beside her. Across from her, Lady Westbrook arranged herself neatly in the opposite chair, pearls glinting softly in the light. The sound of the sea came faintly through the half-open window, a calm murmur that blended with the hiss of the fire. "Well," Lady Westbrook said at last, "I must confess I never suspected Mr. Langley of anything worse than arrogance. How neatly people surprise us, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature seldom changes, my dear. It only hides beneath better manners." Lady Westbrook sighed. "And his poor wife. Such a young woman. I do hope she didn't suffer." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "I believe she found her moment of truth before harm could deepen. Some discover honesty through pain, others through the mirror of another's deceit." The older woman stirred her tea. "And you saw it all, piece by piece. How do you notice such things?" Miss Marple looked toward the window. "It isn't noticing. Exactly. It's remembering. People reveal themselves in what they repeat, how they fold a towel, or how they lie about time. Habit reveals the soul, dear, just as light reveals dust. Lady Westbrook gave a small, thoughtful nod. Then perhaps we all live surrounded by our own patterns. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and when a pattern breaks, the reason is always worth understanding. Silence followed, companionable and unforced. The fire shifted, throwing a soft glow across the carpet. Violet entered quietly with a fresh pot of tea and a plate of small scones. Her steps were light now. The nervousness had gone. Miss Marple thanked her, and the girl smiled before retreating again. "How peaceful everything feels," Lady Westbrook said after a while. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Peace is not the absence of trouble. It's simply what remains after truth has done its work." The clock on the mantel chimed 9. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, her movements steady, unhurried. Outside, the sea answered with its eternal rhythm, as if agreeing. Lady Westbrook leaned back, her expression soft. "You make life sound so tidy." Miss Marple smiled again, eyes warm, but knowing. "Oh, it never is tidy, my dear. We only keep it dusted and in order so that when something truly matters, we can see it clearly." The fire settled into embers, and the house grew still. The mystery had ended, yet understanding lingered quiet, complete, and gently human. And so, dear listener, the calm has returned to the Seaview Hotel. The tide moves softly again, the guests sleep soundly, and the little town below the cliffs breathes in peace once more. What began as a quiet holiday ended, as these things often do, with truth stepping gently into the light. Miss Marple, as ever, asked for no praise, only another cup of tea and a moment by the fire. Her gift, after all, was never in uncovering wickedness, but in restoring the comfort of order. We thank you for joining us tonight on The Curious Case. Your company, like the warmth of a teacup between hands, makes every story feel complete. If you found comfort in this mystery, I invite you to stay with us for the next. There's always another puzzle waiting beyond the garden gate, another whisper behind the curtain of calm. Tell us, before you go, where are you listening from tonight? A small village, a busy city, a quiet corner of your world? I read every reply. They remind me how stories travel farther than footsteps ever can. The fire burns low now. The kettle cools. The sea beyond the windows murmurs its steady lullaby. Somewhere, the village clock begins to chime the hour, slow and certain. Until our next mystery, remember truth cools slower than tea. Good night, and thank you for being part of The Curious Case.